Okay, so we started looking at the Aruch HaShulchan yesterday. Let's go a little bit further in our text over here in Hilchos Tzedakah to look at this ban on accepting tzedakah from non-Jews. One of the questions is the ban on accepting tzedakah from non-Jews, is that inclusive of benevolent Gentiles who are not considered idolatrous? Or is it only on referring to idolatrous Gentiles? And that's something that needs to be properly clarified, because what would be the status of, let's say, righteous Christians or Muslims who want to support Jews? Okay. Im ha'ani eino yachol lichos im hatzdaka shel Yisrael. If, let's say, you have a Jew who cannot subsist off of donations from Jews, muter lo lokachas migoyim b'tzina, so then he's allowed to accept donations privately from a non-Jew, and if he cannot, if there's no option for that, he can even accept them in public if necessary, if that's the only way. And then he says, "Mutar lasim kupot tzedakah b'chanut shel goyim." It is totally permissible to set up pushkas in stores or malls that are where the traffic is non-Jewish traffic. And the reason is kihem miskavnim lahana asam sheyedu sheyesh lahem lekuchot Yehudim. And one of the benefits of that, in other words, part of the issue is that it's considered to be embarrassing for Jews to be reliant on charity from non-Jews. And the reason why you can set up pushkas for Jewish causes in non-Jewish stores is that this actually demonstrates to the non-Jewish public and to the store owner that Jews are patronizing those stores. So it's actually a form of free advertising for this store owner, for him to set up a pushka in his store. So he's benefiting from it at the same time, and so is the Gentile public. Ulam zedavka im ein hagoyim notnim lakupa, aval im heim notnim lakupa lechatchila ein lahaniach et hakupa. That's only if you don't think that the Gentiles are actually putting money in the pushka. But if they're putting money in the pushka, then you shouldn't set up the pushka. Aval b'di'eved yesh mishu posek shemishum darchei shalom ein lahotzi et hakupa me'achanut umutar lehanos me'hakesef. But if it's already there, you're not obligated to remove it because you want to be able to maintain ways of peace. Darchei shalom is to maintain the peace among the Gentiles. So you're going to take away the pushka, the guy's going to think that what you don't want our money, and it's going to create bad feelings. Let me just see. Yeah. Well, the Bayit doesn't have any pushkas, yeah. But Chabad would, and yeah. Yeah, look, I do have a little bit of trouble with this latter statement. I think that he's speaking from a very Israeli perspective, and I don't think that when you live in Eretz Yisrael, you take a very Judeo-centric position. So I wanted to look up the Aruch HaShulchan a little bit more before we go any further, because we were in the middle of it yesterday. And I think we'll see maybe even further qualification. So we're in, let's see. Is there? Mishpat. Skipped it. Okay. And what was the Siman again? The Siman 254, right? Okay. So let me just share this for those who are watching home. He says, so the last thing we learned in the Aruch HaShulchan is that if an Adam Chashuv, an important Gentile dignitary, let's say the mayor of the city or whatever, gives a gift to be distributed, you have to follow his request. Okay, he says, Ve'en li tmoa al mashanagu l'kabel below shum pikpuk. He says, Devadai kevin shahadochak rav mutar k'moshe katavti. He says, you should not be surprised as to why we are of the current practice to accept gifts of tzedakah from non-Jews without any hesitation. He says, because when the needs are great, you are permitted to accept from non-Jews. The Rambam further writes that Ben Noach sheratza la'asot mitzvah mishar mitzvot haTorah kedei lakabel schar. He writes that if a Noachide, which is a righteous Gentile who observes the 7 Noachide commandments, and he wants to do one of the mitzvahs, and he has in mind that he wants to receive a reward for that mitzvah, ein monim oso la'asosa ki hilchasa. You don't refrain from allowing him to do that mitzvah. Vimhevi ola mikabla mimenu. If a righteous Gentile wants to bring a korban to Hashem, you're allowed to accept it. Nasan tzedakah mekablu mimenu. If he wants to give charity, you accept it. V'yeira eli shenosnin osalaniya Yisrael. And the Rambam writes that it seems that you should give the charity that he wants to give to the poor of the Jewish people. Ol v'hu nizon mi Yisrael u'mitzvah lahachioso. He says, but because Hol v'hu nizon mi Yisrael, and I think Aval Adkan Lashono. He says, since I guess part of the sustenance to the Gentile world is through the Jewish people, then it is a mitzvah. He feels it is a mitzvah to give back, to provide him with sustenance. Umari bisman habayis, shekibel olav shelo lavad avodas kolchav v'mayin sham. He says, and that's the Rambam's talking about in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, and the Gentile is not an idolater. He's not worshiping idols. V'gam ata haparnasa zemizeh. He says, and the same thing is true over here. When Gentiles gain sustenance or get parnasa from Jews, and Jews get parnasa from non-Jews, and so they recognize that there's a symbiotic relationship between Jews and non-Jews. He says, and the Gentiles that we're among are not idolaters. And he writes, Ve'ein beinenu ovdei kol chavim, and we don't have among us idolaters. It is permitted to accept charity from non-Jews. V'chol zeh b'nesinas ma'os litzdaka, but that's only when we're talking about charity in the form of cash. Aval kishemenadvin davar lebeis hakneses mekablim mehen. But, and someone asked about Chabad Romano, when a Gentile wishes to give a gift to a synagogue, then there's no restriction at all. Dezehu kamo karban shemekablim mahen, the darshinan ish l'lamed aleim shemekablim mehen karban. The Torah says ish, any man who wishes to give a karban may do so. And the Gemara says from here that you're permitted to accept karbanos in the temple even from non-Jews. Nedarim unedavos, as long as they're voluntary gift offerings. Umin hanehapach liyishmael ein mekablim. Now, if a Jew converts to Islam, however, you don't accept his gift. In other words, a converted Jew, right? The yesh omrim de mekablin v'lo dami lo karban. but some say that you don't accept. In other words, if a Jew turns away from Yiddishkeit, so then that becomes more problematic. So just to take a look at this halacha in the Rambam in its original source, it's Yud Yud. So Hilchos Melachim, Hashem, Kedusha, Zraim, Avoda, Karbanos, Tahara, Nezikim, Kenyan, Mishpatim. Here, Shoftim, sorry, Kings and Wars. The Laws of Kings and Wars, chapter 10. So here, they even have the English translation here. So let's take a look. We should not prevent a Noachite who desires to perform one of the Torah's mitzvahs in order to receive reward from doing so, provided he performs it as required. If he brings an animal to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, we should receive it. If a Noachite who observes the 7 mitzvahs gives charity, we should accept it from him. It appears to me that it should be given to the Jewish poor, for the Noachide may derive his sustenance from the Jews, and they are commanded to support him if necessary. In contrast, if an idolater gives charity, we should accept it from him and give it to the Gentile poor. So there you have it. The basis in accepting gifts, let's say from Christians and Muslims, is that according to many poskim, neither of them qualify as idolaters. Certainly Muslims don't, and according to many poskim, Christians do not qualify as idolaters either. And it's on that basis that you can accept charity from people who are what we would call Noachides, B'nai Noach, especially if they view that they are receiving sustenance from Jews, right? Especially because they feel that they are sustained by their gift. In other words, I'm getting blessed because I'm giving this gift to Jews, then they view it as a privilege for themselves. They view it as being beneficial for themselves to receive this gift. So therefore, the Chilul Hashem aspect is no longer present. Okay, so that's.
Cash transaction doesn't deal with the
You're talking about this last halacha about. Yeah, you can accept cash from them, or even a korban you can accept, because they feel that they're benefiting from giving the korban, and that's what led the Aruch HaShulchan to say that synagogue gifts you can certainly give, because they view that as even more of a benefit to them. They're giving to the house of God. Okay. Let us continue in these halachas. Mutar lekabel matana o halva'a migoy afilu b'farhesia. It is permitted to accept a gift from a Gentile, and even or a loan. You're allowed to accept a loan from a Gentile, even if it's done publicly, even if it's known to the public. It is similarly permitted to accept a gift. The Ramah says this expressly, to accept a gift from a Gentile for the purposes of helping build a shul. You're also allowed to accept cash gifts from non-Jews to help print Jewish svarim and to proliferate Jewish svarim. Okay. In other words, this whole idea, in other words, remember, the whole idea of the initial prohibition that we learned at the beginning of the chapter is you don't want to make a Chilul Hashem. Don't make a Chilul Hashem, where the Gentile world sees, oh, the Jews are leeches. You don't want that to be the prevailing attitude. But if the attitude is, oh, I have an opportunity to do something holy, that we're giving the Gentile world an opportunity for those who truly view it as a blessing for themselves to be able to support Jewish or holy or godly causes, so then there's no prohibition. That's really the guideline that we need to arrive at. You have to.
The last part of the preamble was governing even the you want to destroy them, not give them any merits.
Right. So that right. So that was that seems to be clearly referring to Ovdei Avodah Zarah, to idolaters. It's not referring, because why would we want to see the downfall of righteous Gentiles? Yeah, yeah. Don't don't share this with your friends at the office. Yeah, exactly. Right. Right. No, I think you're right, Lloyd. I mean, you're that's the whole point. Okay. B'chutz la'aretz mutar lekabel kitzvat yeladim o shar ksafim min hamemshala. In outside of Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to accept um, uh, stipends from the government for children, like either not only tax credits, but you're allowed to accept if the government gives out. I don't know. There's a program in the United States called WIC. I don't know what the parallel is in Canada. It's where they give out, free milk and bread, and eggs to young families so that they can feed their kids and give them nutritious meals. Is there such a program in Canada? Okay. You have to qualify with a certain low income and etc. Well, it's a Gentile government. So what if the official religion of the state is idolatrous, right? So that's the concern. But in today's world, there's no real. I mean, I can't imagine unless you live somewhere in the Amazon forest or something. Maybe India. Maybe that's something to consider. That India may qualify as Avodah Zarah. Does the government actually qualify? I don't know. Is it Hindu? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And the question then is that to what degree do people actually worship idols? It's really unclear whether the average 21st century Hindu is an idolater. Same. Yeah, no. So the question is, like if you ask an Indian, how many gods do you believe in? He says, well, we have thousands of gods. But no, seriously, the question is, what do they mean by that? Do they mean they actually worship those gods? And this is something that I think is somewhat gray, even in the poskim, whether that truly qualifies as avodah zarah. The whole feel of avodah zarah is sort of lost in the modern world because people are largely secular. But in any event, certainly something to consider if you find yourself living in India. The Indian government wants to give you money, which is extremely unlikely, right? It's the last place I'd want to live if I was needy. Okay. Yesh poskim shemutar lekabel tzedakah la'aniyim imechalel Shabbos b'farhesia. Oh, mimumer lahachis. There are poskim who say that it is permitted to accept tzedakah for the poor from a person who is publicly Shabbos Shabbos violator. Oh, mimumer lahachis, or for someone who is a mumar lahachis. What that means is that a person who deliberately violates the Torah in order to just be flagrantly a violator. Right? The yesh poskim shaser, and there are those who say that it's not permitted. Ulam bizmanenu ishtana hadith shel mechal Shabbos b'farhesia. He says nowadays the whole halacha of mechal Shabbos b'farhesia, where the person is considered outside the Jewish community because he's not observant anymore, has completely changed. Mekevin shehu begeter tinok shenishpat, because such a person, like we learned from the Chazon Ish when we learned this in the Imrei Yaakov, is a tinok shenishba, a child, like a child who was kidnapped. He doesn't have sufficient knowledge that what he's doing is wrong, and therefore ulachol hadeos muter lekabel mimenu, and therefore everyone would agree that you are allowed to accept tzedakah from such a person. Moish told me that there was a case here in Toronto where an institution would not accept a gift from a non-observant donor, high-profile donor. So it could be that some people are still machmir today, but the general consensus is that you're allowed to accept a gift from a machal Shabbos. Yesh poskim shein mekabel nadav lebinyan beis hakneses o lechol tzorchei beis hakneses me machal Shabbos b'farhesia o mimomer lahachis. Some say that you're not allowed to accept a gift for your shul if the person donating it is a Shabbos violator or someone who flagrantly wishes to demonstrate that he doesn't uphold the Torah. V'yesh poskim shumutar. And then he says, and some say it's okay. Ulam bizmanenu, again, the same idea. Nowadays, the whole din of Machal Shabbos b'farhesia has changed, and you're allowed to accept such a gift from him. But then he writes, Rak shelo yichtavu es shemo b'toch beis hakneses. But he actually is machmir, that you should not write the name of the donor. Do not give him a plaque. Now, no one does that. We all give plaques to people who are not observant when we accept their donations. So that's not something that we comport ourselves with today.
Now, because of the financial contribution, find a way to change things. Why are we not much here?
It's not a question of a way of changing things. We acknowledge that even outside of the laws of tzedakah, people who are not observant do not have the same status as they once had, simply because we live in a world where there is not sufficient appreciation among the Jewish community that observing Shabbos is something that they're obligated to do. People just don't view it that way. And so you can't cast aspersions on any Jew who's not observant because they're violating the Torah. That's for that reason that we will give an aliyah to a Jew who's not Shabbos observant, and we count him as a regular Jew for a minyan, right? Even though he's not observant. It's not. In other words, the way you phrase the question, Ron, you're saying, well, we want to figure out a way to accept their donations. That's not the motivation. The motivation is because they have a completely different status in the eyes of halacha today. And this was established by the Chazon Ish, in the middle of the 20th century, early part of the 20th century. He basically said that today, the whole approach for people who did not grow up religious or had traumatic experiences and left religion is not that we should view them as being completely, as bad people. We view them as being genuinely good people who are proud to be Jewish, but don't have an appreciation for mitzvah observance because they never were raised in a way that would instill them with that value. So, okay, have I answered your question? Okay. All right. Gedolei Yisrael hayu mishtadlim shelo lekabel tzedakah b'shvil beis hakneses v'yeshivas ela rak mishomer Shabbos mishum shehatzlachasam teluya bazeh. Now this is quite interesting. He says, and he's quoting Rav Sternbuch here in Shuvas V'Hanhagos. I should probably pull that up. Maybe I'll do that for tomorrow. Rav Sternbuch says that Gedolei Yisrael of a prior generation had a tradition. Just see. Doug asked the question, what if the donation has been derived from ill-gotten gains? That's a good question. What if you know that someone is involved with criminal activity? So that's I hope he addresses that momentarily. I can tell you that that's a much more serious problem than a person who's Machal Shabbos. You could have a person who is Orthodox, and then he gets convicted of white-collar crime, and in the meantime, his name is on your institution. So what do you do in that situation? And that's actually a real life issue.
I don't know.
Madoff. Madoff is is a high profile example, but there are less high profile examples. We had a case in LA when I was working at an institution where the donor's name was on one of the classrooms, and they took the name off of the classroom, and yeah, but all right, well, hopefully he'll address it. I don't know. Could he sue them in Basin, you're saying, or in a secular court? I don't know if there's a precedent in a secular court for something like that, where a guy says, well, it was a quid pro quo. I gave the $10,000 or $100,000 to have my name on the building, and you took it down, so I want my money back, right? There's got to be some kind of precedent in secular law for something like that. But that's a good question. As far as Basin is concerned, I think there's a real valid argument that a donor could potentially make, saying that if indeed we had a contracts explicitly stated that in exchange for this high amount gift, I get certain privileges, and they talk about the signage, and the letters of the sign shall be no less than 12 inches high. No, seriously, these are things that are actually written in a contract between the family that's donating and the institution. And then the shul or the school or whatever it is wants to take down the name for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they've gotten a bigger gift, 50 years later. This is the Joe and Faye Tannenbaum campus, right? What if now someone came over to us and said, I want to give you a $5 million gift to completely refurbish your building. Well, we should be so lucky. And he says, but on the condition that I want this now to become the Yankel and Sprinza Bernstein campus, right? And so the question is, we would have to go back and look at whatever contract we had with the Tannenbaums, and we'd have to say, well, what is the right thing to do based on the transaction that was made at the time? There may be paperwork, there may not be paperwork. Is there a sunset clause? Is there not a sunset clause? And all of those other things. Well, right, but that's assuming that such a clause would be built into. It would be implied.
Yeah, it could be explicit, but the court implies it in certain terms to make business of the efficacy of the transaction. Or if a person would say, "Oh, of course that would be included in the contract," the courts would say, if it's an unforced, this is the way it was supposed to be or should be, then yeah, I think you guys need to.
Okay. All right. Gedolei Yisrael hayu mishtadlim shelo lekabel tzedakah. Okay, so he says that Gedolei Yisrael in the past, and he's quoting, Rav Sternbach is quoting from the Chafetz Chaim, Reb Chaim Brisker, from some real guns of the prior generation. He says their minhag was not to accept tzedakah for a synagogue or a yeshiva from anyone who was not a Shomer Shabbos, even though you could find a heter not to. But they felt that the success of the institution was dependent upon the donors. And so therefore, there have been traditionally different practices in this regard. I know, for example, there are certain yeshivas, I think in Brisk, I think the minhag was, I don't know if it still is, not to accept charity gifts from anyone who's not Orthodox. Despite all that we have written about Tinok Shenishba and so forth. So what I may do is I may try to print out that shuva for tomorrow that we'll take a look at. And apparently he doesn't go into the whole issue of accepting tzedakah from people who have been convicted of crimes. we'll hold it here for today. And Mirz Hashem,